You're listening to the Play Therapy Podcast with Dr. Brenna Hicks, your source for centered and focused play therapy coaching.
Hi, I'm Dr. Brenna Hicks, the Kid Counselor. This is the Play Therapy Podcast where you get a masterclass in child-centered play therapy and practical support and application for your work with children and their families. In today's episode, I am answering a question from Jen. I've actually answered one of her questions before. She wrote in and asked about the use of games in child-centered play therapy. So that was her original question, and she reached back out and shared a new one, which I think is really important. I've been talking about this in my virtual training cohorts, and I've also talked about this with therapists at my center. So this is certainly a relevant topic, and I think something that will be really helpful for all of us. So let me go ahead and read her question, and then I will share my thoughts on it. So Jen in the UK shared that she's wondering about several recent new clients who are choosing to be silent colorers in the room. I'm spending a lot of time tracking coloring behavior and wondering if I'm doing anything at all. That's not strictly true, as I do believe and feel that embodying the be with attitudes and being truly present with the child in relative silence is giving them what they need at the time. They don't want to leave and they seem happy to come. And I also trust that at some point the nature of the sessions will shift. I guess I would feel more confident knowing what other non-directive child-centered play therapists believe or do in these situations. And I also wonder what their parents will think when the children say, "I colored for an hour without talking." Yes, and that does happen. And I get that feedback. I don't understand how if they just sit there and don't say anything to you and don't talk about their problems, how anything's going to get better. Oh my goodness. So let me say that last sentence again because I digressed. I also wonder what their parents will think when children say, "I colored for an hour without talking." And can a therapist color too? And then there's also the issue of working with selective mutism, which is not uncommon in our child population in London. So she goes on to close and says, "This helps me to feel less isolated in a field in the UK largely dominated by CBT." Oh my goodness, it's not just in the UK, Jen. It's a field largely dominated by CBT all over the world. So here we are fighting the uphill battle against all of the CBT for kids. All right, so Jen, thank you so much for sharing. Thanks for reaching out with another really helpful question. So let's dive into this silence topic because this is something that we're all going to deal with. So we're going to talk through the why behind that choice in the playroom, also the purpose and the intent of the child-centered approach, and then the therapist's role in a scenario like that. So before I dive into those three things, I want to just kind of give an overarching thought about this entire topic. It is a child's choice what they do when they come into the playroom. That's the entire premise of the non-directive child-led approach. So kids can choose to be silent if that is what they choose, but we should never be. So in a child-centered approach, if the child chooses to be quiet, say nothing, just do an isolated, silent, independent activity the entire session, that is their choice. That is what they need. And we support and understand that, but we should never be. And so often therapists struggle that when a child says nothing, the therapist then ends up saying nothing as well, because, well, there's nothing to reflect content-wise, and there's no emotion to reflect, and they're not saying or doing anything. So I don't really feel like I can say much because they're just doing the same thing over and over again. So that gets in our heads, and we tend to match their silence with silence. We should never be silent because even in their lack of verbal communication, they are communicating tons of things to us. And so we have to be in tune and aware and present enough to notice what nonverbal things are taking place in the room because they don't have to say a word. And Jen, you're absolutely right. I've worked with selectively mute children and they don't talk. I've worked with children who are not selectively mute and they didn't say a word to me for 20 sessions. So there is no requirement or expectation that a child's going to talk. They don't need to. Child-centered play therapy works with people who have lost the ability to talk. when you have aphasia or apraxia or speech impediments or speech delays or developmental delays that make it impossible to speak. There's research upon research upon research showing that child-centered play therapy is effective for all of these populations. We're just in a verbal world. So we think that therapy should involve verbal interaction, but there's no expectation that it does. So when kids choose to be silent, we are not. I want to make that very clear right from the get-go, because we can't match their silence with silence, or we lose all of our model and all of our grounding. Our model works because of the way that we respond. Our therapeutic responses help create the environment for the child to do what they need to do. So that was just the straight out of the gate. We have to get something clear. But now let's dive into these 3 ideas. So why? We have to look at all behavior through the lens of why. So if a child is coming in and silently coloring, why? Not that it influences our response at all. We're still going to use the same skills, the same principles, the same approach, because we have that framework. However, the why is meaningful so that we can give them the space to do what they need to do. Almost always, if a child comes in and does an independent, quiet activity, it's because that activity is safe for them. It's because it is structured. It's because it's comfortable. There's not really anything scary about sitting and coloring in a playroom. It can't take you in a direction you're not ready to go. It can't bring up emotions that you're not prepared for. It's not going to be something where you're caught off guard by what unfolds and what happens. It's safe, it's structured, and it's comfortable. Highly anxious kids need this type of play always. It's not always coloring and it's not always silent, but we see this behavior manifest itself in other ways. So the why matters. And there are stages and phases of child-centered play therapy. So in this week's episode earlier in the week, we talked about the phases of therapy. Next week, we're talking about the stages of therapy. When a child first comes in, you're in the initiation phase. They're building a relationship with you. They're building rapport with you. You're a stranger to them. They don't know you. They don't feel comfortable with you. They don't feel safe with you. So if they choose to sit and color and see how things unfold and explore your personality and explore how you're going to respond and get a feel for what all of this is about, that's their way of easing into something. So it's really important that we recognize this is part of the journey for these kids. They don't feel ready to do something else yet, so they do something that doesn't require a whole lot of emotional, mental, or physical energy. So it's perfectly appropriate and normal for a child to color quietly if that's what they need to do. And again, we have to think about the purpose of the child-centered model, which brings us to point number 2. Children know what they need. They know what they struggle with. They know what they need to work on. They know what they need to heal from. So if they're not ready to do anything more than color at the beginning, that's because that's where they are. And as a child-centered play therapist, we recognize that we trust them and their process and their time frame. So if they color for 4 weeks straight, for 8 weeks straight, that's what they need. Or they're avoiding, which brings us into the resistance phase, which that's also relevant. But either way, whether it's because it's the initiation phase and they're not ready, whether it's because they're in resistance phase and they're avoiding, both of those are therapeutically relevant. Both of those are therapeutically valuable. So to look at a child's silent coloring and say, they're not doing what they need to do, or I really wish they would do something else, or they need to talk to me, or parents are going to be frustrated that they're not saying or doing anything. They're not going to pay me to just color with them for an hour. That's all in our head. That's all cognitive and rational and intellectual, and kids are emotional. And if their emotions say the only thing you can handle right now is to color and not really talk, they know themselves and they're doing the work that they need to do. We have to trust them. We have to trust the process. And we have to trust ourselves that we will accept them in whatever state they come. And then finally, our role. So we are never silent. That's our first role. We are verbally engaged even when the child isn't. And then I get new therapists that say, I can only say, oh, you're coloring over there now. Oh, now you're coloring that. Oh, you colored in the lines. Oh, you colored that way instead. I can only say that so many times. I mean, I can't do that for an hour. You're right. That would be really annoying and boring for both of you. So you have to expand your knowledge and your skill and your awareness of how to handle a situation like that. You enlarge the meaning. You notice nonverbals. You find emotions that they're expressing, even if they're not outwardly. Sometimes it's just the micro expression on the face. Sometimes it's a curl of a lip or a squint of an eye or a wrinkle in a forehead. I mean, sometimes you really have to pay attention. And look, as a child-centered play therapist, if you don't have an emotional vocabulary and if you do not have emotional identification and awareness, you are going to struggle. So that's your task. You have to become really adept and really knowledgeable about tiny expressions of emotions. And you have to be able to enlarge the meaning. You have to be able to see what they're doing and interpret that in a meaningful way and in a therapeutic way for them. So your role is to continue to follow the child-centered model. But Jen, to answer your question, and I wonder if a therapist can color too. If you're invited to color, of course, because we follow the child's lead. So if the child says, I want you to color too, or you should draw something, or here's a marker for you, you color, then of course you've been invited, you do it. But if a child doesn't invite you, you don't start coloring because that's not part of the child's journey. So we wait for cues, we wait for suggestions and recommendations from the child. And if the child just wants to color by themselves, then we engage verbally and therapeutically the way we always would. And like I mentioned before, I had a child, he was not selectively mute. He would come in, sit down, play silently for the entire hour. We went 20 sessions. He never said a word to me. And he made every therapeutic gain that any of us could have hoped for. His parents were thrilled. His teachers were thrilled. I was thrilled. He was thriving. He never said a word. And I remember early on, I was a newer play therapist at that time. I hadn't been in the field very long. I had never worked with a child that said nothing to me. And I felt like it was not enough. I felt like he needed to talk. I was waiting for the week that he was going to decide to talk. I actually asked someone at a play therapy conference, this child just won't talk to me. And I have no idea if what I'm saying is on track. I have no idea if I'm reflecting appropriately. And she looked at me and she said, yes, you do. And I will never forget that because that was the permission that I needed to realize that I do know what I'm doing. I am following the model and it works even without discussion. So I think our role is to do what we know to do, to follow the model, to color if we're invited. Otherwise we don't. And we have no expectations that they're going to at one point talk. Now, Jen, you mentioned, I trust at some point the nature of the sessions will shift. It absolutely will, unless it's an outlier like the child I had that went 20 weeks and never said anything. Most often, their safe, structured, comfortable activities are no longer needed shortly into the play therapy process. So it's just to kind of get them there, help them feel settled, comfortable. And then as soon as they realize, I can do something else now. I feel braver. I feel more confident. I feel like I can handle this. I know the work that I need to do. I trust the therapist now. I'm good. They will do something else almost always. Now, whether they talk or not remains to be seen, but they will almost always change and do something in a different thematic concept in the playroom. So yes, it's a patience game and it's a trusting the process. It's a trust yourself, trust the child, trust that they're doing the work that they need to do. As far as parents go, it's really important to be able to articulate the power of what the child's doing. So if the parent comes to you and says, yeah, they said all they're doing is coloring and they're not even talking to you, and I don't think this is going to work. You have to be able to combat that with the why the child is coloring, just like we talked about. You have to be able to talk about the purpose of the child-centered model. You have to be able to talk about your role in the child-centered process. All of the things that we just discussed become your talking points to the parent because they don't understand, they don't know, and you can't expect them to. You can't fault them for being hesitant to think that a child coloring quietly is going to be therapeutic. So you have to arm yourself and equip yourself with the appropriate responses to a conversation like that. And some of those things that I just shared would be a really helpful conversation to have with them, because they need to know that there is a lot of therapeutic work taking place even when a child silently colors in your room. So I hope that's helpful. I hope that, Jen, that answers your question. I hope that for all of us that have quiet kids, it kind of encourages us that we're still on the right track. And I'm just grateful for those of you who write in and ask questions. Thanks for letting me share your question on the air, Jen. I appreciate it. If you have a question or something you'd like me to cover, please email me at brenna@thekidcounselor.com. And I look forward to chatting with you again soon. Thanks so much for being a part of the Play Therapy Podcast family. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Play Therapy Podcast with Dr. Brenna Hicks. For more episodes and resources, please go to www.playtherapypodcast.com.